It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the foothills outside of Bishop, California. That time of year was always my favorite. Cool air in the mornings, warm sun in the afternoons, and just a hint of winter hiding in the breeze. I wasn't planning anything extreme, just 3 nights up in the backcountry, away from people and traffic and the mess of real life. I picked a spot that wasn't marked on any official maps. Just a valley I'd seen once while doing a longer loop trail with friends the year before. It had a wide, shallow creek running through it, thick pine trees, and lots of rocky overhangs and ledges. I remember thinking it looked like the kind of place animals would love. I hadn't seen any campsites nearby last time, which made it even more appealing. I wanted something quiet. I parked at a dirt pull-off by an old Forest Service gate, shouldered my pack, and started in. The hike wasn't long, maybe 6 or 7 miles, but the terrain was rough in spots. Old rock slides had chewed up the trail, and in some places, it was just a line of pressed grass where other hikers had wandered through. I passed one older hunter coming out with a rifle and a pack of gear. We nodded at each other, but that was it. By early afternoon, I reached the valley. The creek was lower than I remembered, just a trickle over dark stones, but still flowing. I found a flat spot near the tree line, not far from a large granite wall that curved inward like a natural amphitheater. The ground was dry and packed, with just enough space to pitch my tent. I dropped my pack, looked around, and stood still for a moment. It was dead quiet. No wind, no birdsong, just the faint noise of water and my own breathing. I set up my tent, rolled out my bag, and boiled water for a quick meal. It wasn't cold yet, but I knew it would get there fast once the sun dropped behind the ridges. After eating, I wandered around camp, looking for dry branches and anything unusual. I always do that, walk the area, make a mental map. You learn to notice little things when you're alone in the woods. About 100 yards uphill, I found a narrow game trail leading toward a cluster of large boulders. There were tracks in the dirt, hoof marks maybe from deer or sheep. At the time, I didn't think much of it. This was wild country. Animals passed through all the time. I kept walking a bit, checking the slope and brush, but didn't see anything living. Just old droppings, some pine cones chewed by squirrels, and lots of silence. As dusk came on, the light turned that sharp, sideways gold you only get in the mountains. I built a small fire in the old ring I found near the tent, mostly just for warmth and a bit of light. I watched the flames and listened to the quiet settle in even deeper. There wasn't a single plane in the sky, no motors, no people. It felt like the whole world had folded in around me, and I was the last one left. That night, I slept fine. A little cold, a little stiff, but nothing unusual. I woke up once around 3 a.m. and stepped out to pee. The moon was out, pale and full, and the granite wall behind me glowed faintly in the light. Everything looked silver. I thought I heard a rustling noise off in the trees, maybe something moving along the creek, but it stopped as soon as I noticed it. Probably a deer. I zipped the tent shut again and went back to sleep. The next day I spent hiking. I followed the game trail up toward the ridge, zigzagging between trees and rocky clearings. I found more hoof prints, some newer, pressed sharp into the dry dirt, others faded and soft. I kept going higher, hoping to get a good view of the valley. Around midday, I reached a broad ledge that stuck out like a shelf over the trees. From there, I could see the curve of the creek, my little orange tent near the bend, and miles of forest in every direction. I stayed up there for a while, eating jerky and watching the sky, but something kept bothering me. Not a sound, but a kind of absence. I hadn't seen a single bird since I got to the valley. No squirrels either. Usually you'd hear at least something, chickadees, jays, even crows, but there was nothing. The trees were dead silent, even with the sun high and the breeze moving. Heading back down, I moved slower. I kept stopping to look around, thinking maybe I was just missing things. But the woods felt still in a way that wasn't peaceful. Felt tense, like something had passed through earlier and scared everything into hiding. That evening, just before sunset, I was near the creek filtering water when I heard the first noise. It wasn't loud, just a clatter of small rocks sliding down the slope behind me. I looked up and saw movement. for maybe 5 shapes coming down the ridge, spaced out and low to the ground. For a second, my heart jumped. Then I saw what they were. Goats. Just some goats. They looked like feral ones. Rough, dirty coats, curved horns, narrow bodies. They picked their way down the rocks like they belonged there, hooves sure and careful. A couple of them stopped to sniff the air, then kept walking single file. They didn't seem to notice me, or if they did, they didn't care. I watched them for a while, trying to figure out where they'd come from. I knew there were feral goats in some parts of California, but I didn't think they came this far inland. Maybe they'd wandered down from some remote range. Maybe they were escapees from a ranch. I didn't know. They moved through the trees and disappeared into the brush near the far end of the valley. I stood there a while longer, then went back to camp. They didn't seem like a threat, but something about the way they moved had me uneasy. Too quiet, too coordinated. That night, I had a harder time falling asleep. I kept thinking about those goats, how clean their tracks had been, how they hadn't made a sound coming down that slope. I kept replaying the clatter of stones in my head. How short it was, almost too short, like they only let me hear it on purpose. Around midnight, I heard them again, crunching footsteps just beyond the trees, hooves on dry needles. The sound came in short bursts, then stopped, then started again from a different angle. I sat up in my bag, straining to listen. My fire had burned out. The moon was higher now, bright enough that the tent walls glowed faintly. I didn't want to unzip the door, but I also didn't want to sit there blind. After a few minutes of silence, I heard breathing. Close. Something exhaled hard, just once, not 10 feet from the tent. I froze. Every hair on my neck stood up. My knife was in the side pocket of my pack, within reach, but I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then came the soft knock of hooves tapping rock. Not walking, just tapping, like waiting. Eventually, the sound faded. I lay there the rest of the night, muscles locked, trying not to breathe too loud. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I found prints all around the camp. Hoof prints, small and sharp, like those of the goats I'd seen. They circled the tent, moved to the fire pit, then out toward the creek. There were so many I couldn't count them. It looked like a whole herd had been walking around my tent while I lay inside, completely still. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed fast, barely stopping to check my gear. I wanted out. I could say I was overreacting, that they were just animals, but something about them wasn't right. Goats don't circle people in the dark. They don't sneak that quiet. They don't breathe like that. The hike out was long and hot. I kept looking behind me, listening for sounds on the trail. At one point, I saw hoof prints in a soft patch of dirt, fresh, sharper than mine. I started walking faster. About 3 miles from the car, I stopped at a small clearing to rest. I was down to half a bottle of water and could feel a headache starting. While I sat on a rock trying to cool down, I noticed a shape standing in the trees. One goat, just watching. It stood still, maybe 40 yards away, in the shadow of a juniper. I could barely see its face, just the outline of its horns and the glint of light off its eyes. It didn't move. It didn't eat or scratch or blink. I stood up and kept walking. I didn't run, I didn't want to, but I didn't stop again. When I finally got back to my car, I tossed my pack into the back seat and locked the doors before I even sat down. I started the engine, turned the air all the way up, and sat there for 5 minutes just breathing. Then I drove, fast, windows up, music on, eyes on the road. Back in town, I stopped at a small diner to eat and tried to act normal. Tried to shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the woods. I told myself, yes, just some goats. That's all they were. But weeks later, I still think about them. How they stood so still. How they waited until night to get close. How they moved around my tent without making a sound. I tell myself they were just animals, just goats. But I've seen animals in the wild. They move differently. They act on instinct. They don't plan. They don't test you. I haven't gone back to that valley. I probably never will. Because in the end, yes, they were just goats. But I think they knew I was there before I ever saw them. And I think they wanted me to know they knew. It started out as a solo weekend plan to get away from everything. I'd had a long week, and the idea of disappearing into the woods with nothing but my pack, some trail food, a tent, and the crunch of pine needles under my boots was exactly what I needed. I chose a place I hadn't been before, an area called Red Creek Ridge, tucked in the corner of a state forest 2 hours from home. It wasn't popular. In fact, most people in the hiking forums hadn't even heard of it. A guy I'd spoken with online said it was quiet, underused, and pretty rugged. That's what I was looking for. No people, no noise, just trees, dirt, and solitude. I drove out on a Saturday morning, stopping at a small gas station at the last town before the trailhead. I filled up, grabbed a Gatorade and some peanuts, and asked the cashier if he'd heard of Red Creek Ridge. He just said, "It's back in there," and motioned vaguely toward the window, like I was already on my way. The road to the trailhead was rough, mostly gravel, winding, climbing. For about half an hour, I didn't see another vehicle, and I started to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn. There were no trail signs. My GPS dropped out halfway there, and I was relying on a printed map I'd brought. Eventually, I reached a clearing with a dirt lot barely big enough for 2 or 3 cars. No one was there. I parked, checked my gear, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail itself wasn't really a trail, just an old fire road that had partially grown over. Trees arched above me. It was the kind of forest that felt old and heavy. The air had that deep woods smell, damp bark, wet leaves, a kind of soft rot. I could hear the faint sound of running water somewhere far off, probably the creek, but otherwise it was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my boots brushing through the undergrowth. The hike was tougher than I expected. Not steep, just uneven. The trail would vanish in places, then reappear 100 yards ahead. I followed the ridgeline, checking my compass and making sure I was heading west like the map said. Around noon, I stopped on a mossy rock to eat and drink. I hadn't seen a single person or any signs of people. No trash, no boot prints, nothing. I liked it that way. By mid-afternoon, I reached a flat, open spot near a dry creek bed. There were signs of old campfires there, just a few blackened rocks arranged in a ring. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I decided to make that my spot for the night. I pitched the tent, rolled out my sleeping pad, hung my food bag up high, and spent a couple hours wandering the area without my pack, just seeing what was around. The woods were beautiful, sure, but something about the place was off. Not in a supernatural way, just off. I don't know how to explain it. The trees didn't feel like they were watching me. That would sound like paranoia, but they did feel still in a weird way, like nothing in this place moved unless you made it move. As the sun dipped, the temperature dropped hard. I built a fire from fallen branches and sat with my back to a tree, eating beef jerky and trail mix. I didn't bring a book. I just wanted to sit, think, decompress. I watched the sky go black. There was no moon, just stars. I stared at them until I dozed off a little and the fire died down to red flickers. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I hadn't gone to bed in the tent yet. I was still in my sleeping bag beside the fire pit. It was freezing. The fire was long dead, and everything was silent. But I was wide awake in a way that felt sudden and wrong. You know that feeling when something wakes you up, but you don't know what? That's what it was. I sat up slowly and scanned the tree line. There was nothing there, no sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves and cold, that I'd fallen asleep out in the open and freaked myself out. I got up, shook the cold from my limbs, and went to the tent. I zipped up inside and lay still. Maybe half an hour later, I heard it. A crunch. Leaves and twigs, maybe 30 feet away. Then nothing. I held my breath. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. One step, then stillness. I lay there, listening so hard my ears rang. Then another crunch. Closer. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there, every muscle locked. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't using a flashlight. There was no light outside at all. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, Just lay there staring into the dark, counting seconds, then minutes, then hours. At some point, birds started chirping. The forest came back to life. That's when I finally moved. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold. Everything looked the same as before, nothing out of place. But when I walked the perimeter of my little camp, I saw it. About 20 feet from the fire ring, right in the dirt, was a partial boot print. Not mine. Bigger, wider, a different tread. The toe was pointed toward the tent. I packed up in 15 minutes.
No breakfast, no coffee.
I didn't even take the tent down properly. Just yanked the poles and stuffed the fabric into my pack. I started back toward the car, checking behind me every few steps. The return hike should have taken 2 hours. Took nearly 4. I lost the trail twice, partly from rushing, partly from nerves. Every time I stopped to check the map or breathe, I felt watched. Not by animals, not by nature, by something human. When I finally reached the car, I was soaked in sweat and shaking. The truck was untouched. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started it up. The engine stalled the first time. I turned the key again, and it came to life. I backed out fast, throwing gravel behind me, and didn't stop until I reached the gas station again. I sat in the lot there for half an hour before I could drive the rest of the way home. I didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. Then, one night, I was going through my phone, looking at pictures I'd taken during the hike. Just trees and trail stuff. But in one photo, taken right before I made camp, I noticed something. In the far background, half concealed by trees, was the faint outline of a figure. Barely visible, but definitely there. No color, no face, just a shape. Upright. Human. I hadn't seen it at the time. I deleted the picture. I deleted them all. I haven't been back to Red Creek Ridge since. I probably never will. Not because I believe in ghosts or monsters or anything like that, but because sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't some creature hiding in the woods. It's people. And someone else was out there that night, watching me. They didn't say a word. They didn't attack. They didn't steal anything. They just walked close enough to let me know they were there. That was enough. I was in my early 20s back then, midsummer, right in that narrow window where your responsibilities are light enough that you can disappear into the woods for days and not have to answer to anyone. I had a group of friends, climbers mostly. We weren't professionals or anything, just a handful of dirtbags who knew how to stretch $1 and weren't afraid of falling once in a while. We spent most of our summers out near the Hartsdown Forest area, a decent-sized stretch of wooded land a couple hours from the city, known for its bouldering spots and some decent trad routes. Not well policed, no rangers, not really a park. More like the kind of place you only knew about if someone told you. We would drive out Friday after work, climb through the weekend, crash in our tents overnight, and head back Sunday night, sore, sunburnt, and bruised, but satisfied. Most of the time it was uneventful. Just forest, sweat, and that dry, metallic smell of crushed chalk sticking to your fingertips and clothes. We'd come prepared with gear, food, and enough alcohol to dull the pain. It wasn't wilderness survival, but it wasn't comfortable either. Just us and the trees. There were 5 of us regulars, me, Mark, Alice, Jordan, and Tam. We rotated gear, took turns driving, and usually camped near the edge of the tree line about a quarter mile from the boulders. The spot we used wasn't on any map. It was just a small clearing we'd stumbled on the first time out there. It was flat enough for 2 or 3 tents, had a fire ring someone before us had set up with rocks and old ash, and it was just far enough from the road that we rarely saw other people unless they were climbers too. I remember one trip in particular, probably the 3rd or 4th time we camped out there. It was early July, hot during the day, but still cold enough at night to want a decent sleeping bag. We were there for a 3-day weekend, and the first 2 days were as routine as they get. Climb until your hands are raw, eat something mostly edible, then sit around the fire until you can't keep your eyes open. That Saturday night, we crashed like always. Alice had pitched her tent a few feet from mine. She'd left her gear, her harness, helmet, climbing shoes, and chalk bag just outside the vestibule. She always did that, said she didn't want the stink in her sleeping bag. We all sort of did the same. No big deal. When we woke up the next morning, her gear was gone. Not everything, just a few things. Her boots, some climbing clothes, and the chalk bag. The harness and helmet were still there. We poked around a bit, thinking maybe she packed them up while half asleep or moved them into her tent during the night, but nothing turned up. I remember we all stood around kind of dumbfounded, half convinced it had to be a raccoon or something. I mean, what the hell would someone even want with used climbing shoes? And all the chalk? We chalked it up, no pun intended, to our own carelessness. Maybe she left them near the boulders. Maybe some animal dragged them off. It didn't make sense, but we didn't want to think about any other possibilities. It's easier not to believe people might be watching you while you sleep in the woods. We didn't talk about it much after that weekend, and eventually we stopped thinking about it entirely. Just one of those weird things you file under and move on from. But we didn't forget. The following summer, we were back at the same place. Same clearing, same boulders, same time of year. Nothing unusual at first. It was the same crew minus Jordan. He'd moved out of state. We pitched our tents, set up camp, climbed, ate. No one mentioned the incident from the year before. It just didn't come up. I remember the fire that night was burning low. It was close to midnight. We'd all eaten, and I think Mark was halfway asleep leaning against a log. Tam was fiddling with a jet boil, probably heating up more water for tea. I'd had a few beers and needed to piss, so I wandered off into the woods. I didn't bring a flashlight, but the moon was out and I didn't go far, just past the range of the firelight, maybe 30 or 40 feet. I was standing there, eyes adjusted to the dark, just looking at the tree lean in front of me, when I noticed something off. It wasn't movement at first. It was texture, a shape that didn't quite blend into the natural pattern of branches and leaves. You know how your brain fills in the gaps when you're looking into the woods? It's like your vision tries to tell you what should be there. But this wasn't right. There was a person lying on the ground, flat on their stomach, head propped up slightly like they were peeking over a small rise in the dirt. At first, I thought it was an animal. Then I thought it was one of the others, maybe playing a prank. But the outline was all wrong. Too still, too low to the ground. Took me a full 10 seconds to realize the guy was wearing a ghillie suit. You know, those camouflage suit snipers where that looked like grass and leaves? It was patchy, like it had been made with actual brush tied into it. It blended in perfectly. If I hadn't stopped and stared for a while, I never would have seen him. He was facing our camp. I don't know how long he'd been there. I don't know what he saw, but I remember the feeling of my spine tightening, like my whole back had just iced over. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just watched him. Then, very slowly, his head turned toward me. I don't know if he saw me before that, or if the sound of me standing there gave me away. But the second our eyes met, if he could even see me in the dark, he jerked up like a cat and sprinted. No sound, no voice, just a blur of movement and then nothing. He was gone. 1 second he was lying flat, the next he was just part of the woods again. I ran straight back to camp, heart hammering in my throat. The others were still by the fire, and I didn't say a word. I just sat there, silent, staring into the dark. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did, after I finally told them what I'd seen. We packed up at first light, drove home without saying much. It wasn't like we could go to the police. What were we going to say? A man in a ghillie suit was watching us from the woods? No crime, no face, no proof. Just a bad feeling and a memory that burned itself into my skull. We never went back to that spot. Not once. We still climb sometimes. We still camp. But always closer to town, always near people, and always with a hell of a lot more caution. Looking back, it's hard not to tie it all together. The missing gear, the silent watcher in the night. It might have been unrelated. Could have been some messed up hunter or a prepper playing Rambo in the forest. Maybe he wasn't dangerous. Maybe he was just curious. But I don't believe that. You don't lie in a ghillie suit watching strangers sleep unless you mean something by it. And the fact that he didn't approach, didn't speak, didn't make himself known, that said everything. It wasn't about theft. It wasn't about gear. It was about us. We were the ones being watched. Maybe the year before, he took Alice's stuff just to see how we'd react. Maybe he wanted to test our boundaries, see how close he could get. And maybe When I saw him that night, he realized he'd pushed too far. We'll never know. We never saw him again. But I think about it every time I'm in the woods. Every time I unzip a tent, or set down my backpack, or wake up to the sound of branches snapping just beyond the firelight. I don't believe in monsters or ghosts, but I believe in that man. I saw him with my own eyes, and somewhere out there he's still watching. Maybe not me, maybe not anyone I know, but someone, and they probably won't see him coming. In the spring of 2012, I set off to thru-hike the Appalachian Trail. I was 27, recently unemployed, and needed something that felt real. Something far from fluorescent lighting and spreadsheets and the sound of keyboards. I wanted dirt under my fingernails and sore calves and long stretches of time without a phone signal. I didn't have much of a plan, just a decent Osprey pack, worn-in trail runners, a light shelter, and some savings. It turned out to be the loneliest and most beautiful experience of my life. By late June, I was well into Virginia, somewhere south of Shenandoah, though I don't remember the exact mileage marker. That stretch of the trail was quieter than others. The terrain rolled a little more gently there, and most of the hikers I'd started with had spread out or peeled off. I was walking solo. Days would go by without seeing more than one or two people. Word of mouth is everything on the trail. Stories pass from mouth to mouth like campfire smoke. Shelter gossip, wildlife warnings, trail angels, and eccentric locals. One name that had floated through campgrounds and trail journals was the Ice Cream Man. Supposedly, an old man who lived right off the trail, with a little white house at the edge of the woods, gave out free ice cream to hikers passing by. No one could pin down exactly where he was. Some said he was near Catawba, others said farther south. People said he used to be a teacher or a priest or something. The stories made him sound like a quirky old grandpa. I didn't think much of it. Trail legends always get warped in the retelling. But then one hot, muggy afternoon, I came across a small wooden sign nailed to a tree right off the trail. It just said, "Ice Cream," in thick black letters. The arrow pointed down a side path I would have otherwise missed. It looked like an overgrown deer trail at best. But I was overheating, low on water, and curious. I hesitated. There was always a voice in the back of my head reminding me that I was a solo female hiker. I didn't always listen to that voice, but I heard it. Still, the idea of something cold, even a half-melted store-brand popsicle, was too tempting. The sun had been hammering me for hours, and I felt that particular kind of heat dizzy you only get when you've been hiking uphill with a pack in 90-degree weather. So I turned and followed the path. It twisted through thick brush for maybe a quarter mile. At one point, I wondered if I'd misread the sign or if it was old, forgotten, no longer relevant. But eventually the brush opened up into a small clearing, and there it was, a squat white house with green shutters, mostly hidden behind tall weeds and a rusted wire fence. No cars in the driveway. A wind chime made of spoons clinked in the breeze. There were old garden statues in the grass, faded gnomes and cracked cherubs, leaning at odd angles. It had that look of a place that used to be cared for, but hadn't been maintained in years. I walked up to the front porch. A handmade sign near the door said, "Hikers welcome. Ring bell." I did. The chime echoed through the inside of the house, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. The door opened and I found myself face to face with the Ice Cream Man. He looked older than I expected, easily mid-70s, maybe more. His glasses were thick and round, and he had that type of skin that looked almost paper-thin, with liver spots scattered across his forehead and arms. He wore a button-down shirt tucked into beige slacks, but no belt. The shirt had a faint orange stain near the collar. He smiled, though something about it didn't quite reach his eyes. He extended his hand and placed his other hand gently over mine as if guiding me. I remember how dry and cool his skin felt. Without saying a word, he slowly led me inside. The house smelled like old wood and a faint mustiness, like a closed library in summer. The living room was crowded, furniture too big for the space, covered in crocheted blankets, doilies on every surface. There were framed photos everywhere, black and white portraits, faded Polaroids, some water-damaged, others curled at the edges from time. All of the people in them looked vaguely related, but none familiar. A few had been turned face down. He walked me into the kitchen. It was clean but outdated. Mint green counters, white cabinets with brass handles, one of those old beige rotary phones mounted on the wall. He pointed to a seat at the kitchen table and walked to the freezer. He pulled out a plastic wrapper, peeled it open, and handed me a slightly frostbitten orange creamsicle. It was the kind you buy in packs of 12 at Walmart. I took it, thanked him instinctively, and started eating. Then he did something I still think about. He opened a drawer, took out a thin hardcover book, and sat across from me. It was Where the Wild Things Are. He opened it carefully, and as I ate, he started reading. Softly, slowly, deliberately. His voice was high-pitched for a man his age and cracked on the longer sentences. He didn't look up once. The air was warm and very still. I could hear the hum of the old refrigerator behind him. Somewhere in another room, a clock ticked, loud and steady. I finished the popsicle and set the stick on the wrapper. He kept reading. I sat motionless, unsure if I should say something or if interrupting him would break something fragile. Finally, after the last page, he closed the book and placed it on the table. He folded his hands and stared at the tablecloth. Then, without speaking, he got up and walked out of the room. I heard his footsteps move down the hall. I sat there alone. I waited, unsure what to do. 10 seconds passed. Then a minute. The fridge clicked on again. I got up slowly, walked through the living room, and let myself out. As I stepped back onto the porch, I looked around. I don't know why I hadn't noticed before, but there was a metal bucket by the stairs filled with used popsicle sticks, hundreds of them, all orange. The wind chime tinkled again. I walked down the path back to the trail without looking back. That night, I camped at a small shelter 6 miles south. It rained for part of the night, and water dripped down from the shelter's roof onto my bag. I barely slept. The whole encounter had made my skin itch in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like I had brushed up against something I shouldn't have. The next day, I hiked another 15 miles and didn't mention the ice cream man to anyone. I didn't want to explain it, and I didn't want to hear other people's versions of the story. A few weeks later, I found myself in a trail town with decent cell service. Out of pure curiosity, I tried Googling him. Appalachian Trail Ice Cream Man, Old Man, Virginia. Nothing came up. Not even a Reddit thread or a Facebook group post. I asked a few locals at a diner. They just gave me blank looks. One guy thought I meant the gas station near Roanoke that sold soft serve. No one knew what I was talking about. It made me question whether other hikers I'd heard the story from even saw him. Maybe the story had just been a name passed along, repeated out of tradition. Maybe he had been real once and I just stumbled on the last year he did it. Or maybe he was never supposed to be a trail angel to begin with. A month later, I finished the trail in Maine. Katahdin was cold and windy and perfect. The experience had changed me, no cliche, just truth. I returned home lean, calloused, and quieter. Most people wanted to hear about the bears or the hardest climbs. I didn't tell anyone about the ice cream man. But sometimes, when I walk past a freezer section and catch the smell of orange popsicles through the plastic doors, I remember the way he held my hand, the way he read that book like it was sacred, the way the photographs in his living room faced the wall, and I remember the bucket of sticks on his porch, all orange. That part always sticks with me the most. I was in 7th grade when it happened. I can still tell you exactly what I was wearing that day. A red t-shirt with a faded skateboarding logo, cargo shorts, and a pair of black Vans that were already splitting at the sides. My bike was a hand-me-down Trek with chipped blue paint and mismatched handlebars. The kind of bike that rattled if you rode too fast. But I loved it. I rode it everywhere. This was in Cutler Ridge, Florida. That swampy, sticky part of South Florida that exists somewhere between suburbia and tangled wilderness. You could ride for 10 minutes and be at a strip mall, then keep going and find yourself swallowed up by thickets of palmettos, dead-end trails, and mosquito-choked ditches. It was a Friday. I remember because it was the start of spring break, and I was in a good mood. I'd packed some snacks, told my mom I was heading out to the trail for an hour, and left without much of a plan. I liked to just ride. No route, no destination. Just pedals spinning and sweat soaking through the back of my shirt. At that age, freedom was everything. There's a paved bike path that runs behind the high school, skirts the edge of some old government property, then winds into a stretch of overgrown county land. Locals just call it the woods, though it's mostly scrub, pine, and abandoned trail spurs that lead nowhere. It wasn't beautiful, but it was quiet. There were rarely people out there, maybe the occasional runner or someone walking a dog. I liked that. I liked the feeling of being somewhere just on the edge of the world. I'd been riding for maybe 30 minutes when I saw him. At first, I didn't really process what I was looking at. I was coming around a slow bend in the trail, ducking under a low-hanging branch, when something white caught my eye through the brush. I slowed down, just a little, enough to glance over. He was maybe 20 feet off the path, partially behind a scraggly palmetto trunk. The white on his head stood out starkly against the green. At first, I thought it was a Halloween mask, a pointed hood, like a dunce cap with eye holes. Then my brain started connecting things. The sharp point, the holes cut just for the eyes, the loose, draping fabric. It was a Ku Klux Klan hood. Only that, nothing else. He was completely naked otherwise, not even shoes, and he was standing there, facing the trail, alone, in the middle of the day, touching himself. I remember the feeling in my chest before anything else. That drop, like an elevator cable snapping. A free fall that hit me just below the ribs and didn't stop. I looked away so fast I almost lost control of the bike. The handlebars jerked, my front tire clipped the edge of the pavement, and I had to fight to stay upright. I didn't look back. I just pedaled, hard. My legs were already burning from the ride out, but now I felt them kick into overdrive. I didn't even hear the rattling of the chain or the thud of my tires over cracked pavement. Everything in my ears was roaring blood. I didn't know if he'd seen me. I didn't know if he was moving. I just rode like he was right behind me. The trail felt longer going back, like it had stretched. I passed the same landmarks, the same graffiti-scarred fences, the same knocked-over trash cans near the old park entrance, but they looked different. The air felt hotter, denser, couldn't breathe right. My chest was tight, my mouth was dry. When I finally made it back to my neighborhood, I didn't stop. I kept pedaling all the way up to my driveway, dumped the bike in the grass, and ran inside. I didn't say anything to my mom. I went straight to my room, shut the door, and sat on the floor. I stayed there for almost an hour just breathing, listening for nothing. My legs were shaking. My hands too. I hadn't cried. Not yet. That came later when I tried to sleep. That night, I kept seeing him every time I shut my eyes. That mask, the obscene stillness of his body, the way he was just standing there like it was normal, like he was allowed to be there. I didn't tell anyone for a few days. When I finally did, I told my best friend first, in whispers on the bleachers after school. I didn't tell a teacher. Not my mom. Not at first. I couldn't even say the word masturbating out loud without cringing. I was too embarrassed. I didn't even really understand what I'd seen, only that it had ripped something open inside me I didn't know how to fix. When I eventually told my mom, she didn't laugh. She got quiet. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. She asked where it was. I told her. She told me never to go back there again. She called the sheriff's department. I remember sitting at the kitchen table while she spoke in clipped, stiff words over the phone. I could tell she didn't want to repeat the details. She said indecent exposure and possibly a threat to children. I heard her say, "My son's in 7th grade. He shouldn't have to see that." A deputy came to the house later that day. He was polite, calm, and asked a lot of questions I didn't know how to answer. What direction was he facing? Did he follow you? Did you see a car nearby? Could you describe his build, his race, his age? I said I didn't know. I'd only seen the hood, and the rest of him had been... I couldn't finish the sentence. The deputy nodded like he'd heard stories like this before. He said they'd send someone to check the area, maybe set up a camera, maybe patrol more often, but there wasn't much they could do unless they caught him in the act. I remember feeling cold when he said that, like the whole thing was just floating out there, unresolved. I didn't ride my bike for weeks after that. Every time I walked near the edge of our street, I looked toward the treeline. Every shadow looked like him. I'd wake up in the middle of the night sweating, heart racing, convinced he was standing outside my window, just watching. I developed a habit of double-checking the locks. I started keeping my blinds closed all the time. At school, I couldn't concentrate. I'd stare at the board and not see anything. I'd flinch whenever someone walked up behind me. I avoided the trail, the woods, even the sidewalk that ran alongside the high school fence. Something inside me had rewired. Couldn't undo it. Eventually, things got a little better. Summer came. I took a trip to visit my cousins in Georgia. I didn't think about Florida for a few weeks. When I got back, I eased back into normal life. I started riding my bike again, but only on neighborhood streets, never near the trail. I never saw him again. No one ever followed up. The sheriff's office never called. No news reports.
No arrests.
No man in hood headlines. It was like it never happened, but it had. Years passed. I finished high school, moved away for college. Cutler Ridge became a blurry part of my memory. Heat, humidity, and long days of nothing much. But that one memory never softened. I could still recall it in perfect detail. The white hood, the eye holes, the sick feeling in my stomach. Even in college, the memory crept back sometimes. If I was walking alone at night, if I heard a branch snap in the woods, if I saw someone wearing white, and always I'd think, why? Why there? Why that day? Why me? I've read about how some traumas get stuck in the body, how your brain stores the memory like it's still happening. That's what it felt like. No matter how much time passed, it lived just under my skin. I didn't really talk about it again until I was in my 20s. I told the story once at a party, framed as a crazy thing from middle school. People laughed. Someone said, "Only in Florida." Another person made a joke about backwoods creeps. For a minute, it was funny. For a minute, it felt lighter. But that night, I laid in bed and felt like I was 13 again. I could see the trees, the bend in the trail, that white hood. I don't think I'll ever completely forget it. I don't think you can unsee something like that or erase the fear that wraps around it. But I've come to understand it as a moment that changed me. Not in some dramatic, life-altering way, but in a slow, creeping kind of way. It made me more cautious, more aware. It stripped away a piece of innocence I didn't know I still had. And even now, when I'm hiking alone, miles from anyone, I sometimes think back to that figure in the trees. The strangeness of it, the danger that came with the absurd. And I remind myself that the world can be strange and terrifying and deeply unfair, and still, somehow, you keep going. You grow up, but some memories follow, not like ghosts, just like footprints in wet sand. They fade, but they never really go away.
FT.
I was 17 when I did the solo expedition for my Duke of Edinburgh Gold Award. It was something I'd worked towards for years, bronze, silver, now gold. I chose the Southern Tablelands for my 3-day hike and campout. The location wasn't too far from home, but it was remote enough to meet the expedition requirements. I told myself it was safe. I had maps, a personal locator beacon, a first aid kit, emergency numbers, backup food, and a good tent. The forecast was clear, the temperatures mild. I practiced the route before. I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. The hike started on a Friday morning. My dad dropped me at the trailhead and watched me disappear into the bushline. It was scrubby, eucalyptus-dense terrain, dotted with granite boulders and low ridges. The air smelled dry and clean, a mix of sun-heated bark and leaf litter. I had my 65-liter pack fully loaded, boots broken in, and my phone was off to preserve battery. I'd only turn it on each night to check in via text. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 16 kilometers. The route wound past creeks and up rocky inclines. There were barely any signs of people, just the occasional fire ring or flattened patch of grass. I pitched my tent near a small stream. I wasn't sure of the exact name. It wasn't marked on the map, but it was maybe 40 meters from the clearing I chose. I didn't want to camp right on the water, snakes, bugs, flood risk, but I needed to stay close for cooking and refills. I boiled water for pasta and sat on a log while the last of the daylight drained out. Everything was still. The only sounds were the frogs, the distant call of birds bedding down, the wind through dry grass. It felt safe in that kind of silence. Comforting, even. I wrote a few notes in my journal, read a few pages of a book, and by 9 o'clock I was zipped up in my tent. I fell asleep listening to the soft gurgle of the creek and the wind scraping faintly across the flysheet. The second day, I hiked another 14 or so kilometers. It was tougher, more elevation, less shade, but I made it to a ridge overlooking the valley. I felt good, strong, like I was really doing something worthwhile. That night, I camped under a grove of stringy barks. I hung my food, kept everything clean, followed the rules. It rained a little before dawn, but the tent held. The third day, I looped back toward my original camp area. My planned route brought me within a few hundred meters of that first night's spot. I passed the same stream, the same log where I'd eaten my dinner. I remember noticing the water had gone a little murkier, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I made camp about half a kilometer further down trail that night, just to vary the route and stay within the guidelines. When I finally got picked up the next morning, I was sunburned, sore, and starving for a proper meal, but proud. My parents were proud too. I sent in the paperwork and wrote up my report. I slept like a rock that night, the first in a real bed in 4 days. The next day was when everything fell apart. It started with a headline I saw on my phone after breakfast. My dad had the news on in the background, but I was scrolling while half listening. The words hit me like a kick to the chest. Severed head found in remote Tablelands Creek. The article didn't show photos, but it gave a location, somewhere near a dry tributary, off a hiking track, near a disused fire trail. It was exactly where I'd camped that first night. 40 meters. That's a few seconds walk. That's tossing distance. I knew the spot they were describing. I could see it in my head, the flat bank, the angled granite outcrop, the creek that had turned a little cloudy the day after. My stomach turned cold. I reread the article 3 times, then again. Then I just sat there, completely still, while the sound of the news droned on in the background. My fingers went numb. I couldn't move for a while, couldn't think straight. The report was short. The head had been found by a pair of off-duty rangers doing water quality surveys. It was lodged between rocks, partially covered by debris.
No identificación.
No body, no known missing persons reported in the area.
No suspects. No timeline.
It was being handled by homicide. The next few hours passed in a kind of daze. I kept wondering, was it there when I camped? Had it been just downstream from where I boiled water? Did I walk right past it? Did I hear something and write it off as wildlife? I racked my brain, trying to remember everything. That first night had been so quiet. I hadn't heard footsteps, no voices, no cracking branches, no unusual smells. But now I second-guessed it all. I thought about how the water seemed a bit off the next day, just slightly discolored. I chalked it up to runoff. But now, I had eaten next to that stream. I had filled my bottle from it. The worst part wasn't just the physical proximity. It was knowing that whoever did it, whoever dumped the head there, had been nearby, could have watched me set up my tent, could have seen the glow of my headlamp or the flicker of my camp stove. Maybe they'd already dumped the head before I arrived. Maybe they came back while I was sleeping. I started scanning through the photos I'd taken. Most were of the trail, the trees, the ridge, but there were a few from camp. One in particular showed the creek behind my tent. In the background, just past the bank, there was something that made my heart skip. A rock mostly, or maybe a bundle of branches, but it had a strange shape to it. Rounded, unnatural. I zoomed in until the pixels turned muddy. I couldn't tell what it was. My brain tried to make it into something familiar, an animal, a stick, a bit of bark. But part of me was already sure I knew what it was. I didn't send the photo to anyone. I didn't tell my parents what I thought I might have seen. I kept it to myself and tried to sleep that night, with the image burned into the inside of my eyelids. The following week, the story developed further. Police cordoned off a large section of the bushland near the creek. Forensic teams were seen going in. No other body parts were found. No DNA matches had been made public. The case was being treated as an isolated homicide. They asked for hikers in the area to come forward with any footage, photos, or information. I didn't submit anything. I told myself it was because I hadn't seen anything important. I told myself I didn't want to be dragged into an investigation, that it wouldn't help. But the truth was I didn't want to know. I didn't want them to tell me I'd camped next to it, or worse, that I'd walked past the killer. I started waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard something outside my window. I checked locks 3 times before bed.
Y sto pediking solo.
The thought of a tent wall between me and the rest of the world suddenly felt like the thinnest protection imaginable, like trying to hide behind paper. The news moved on eventually. No suspect was ever named. No identity was ever confirmed. The articles grew shorter, less frequent, until they stopped entirely. Just one more unsolved murder in the long, strange catalog of Australian wilderness. I finished my gold award later that year. The ceremony felt hollow. Every time someone asked me about the expedition, I smiled and nodded and said it had been great. A real challenge. Great scenery. Lots of wildlife. I never told them what happened after. I never told them about the creek. A few months later, I went back to the trailhead in my car. I didn't hike in, just stood at the edge of the bush and stared into the trees. It was late afternoon again, same time I'd started that hike. The shadows looked familiar. The wind smelled the same. Somewhere in all that stillness, someone had done something terrible, and I'd slept through it, or walked past it, or maybe I'd never known how close I came. But I'd never forget the feeling when I found out. That sudden, crushing awareness that the world is not as safe as you want it to be. That sometimes you are only meters away from something unspeakable, and you have no idea. I never camped alone again, and I deleted that photo. I couldn't look at it anymore. But even now, years later, I still see it when I close my eyes. The blur of rocks and water, that dark shape just under the surface, and the sick, unmistakable feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Not really, not ever.